Mexico Profundo. Chapter 3. De-Indianizing that which is Indian. Even though the dominant colonial ideology restricts the living Mesoamerican heritage to the population recognized as Indian, the national reality holds within itself a different truth. The effective presence of that which is Indian is found in almost every social and cultural aspect of the country. It is expressed in cultural traits of very different kinds, traits that undeniably have their origin in Mesoamerican civilization, and that are variously distributed into different groups and strata of Mexican society. The presence of Indian culture is, in some aspects, so commonplace and omnipresent that one rarely stops to think about its profound significance, or about the long historical process that made it possible, its persistence in social sectors that assume a non-Indian identity today. One or many ways of life. In all Indian cultures, diversity can be observed, but within the basic unity of Mesoamerican civilization. The same is not true of the different cultural groups in non-Indian Mexico. Here, the differences are much more marked. As we will see, they are not explained fully if we try to see them as variants or subcultures of the same civilization. Behind their plurality, there is a history of power relationships within the scheme of colonial domination. Let me mention something that will receive more detailed attention later. The lack of unity and coherence in the non-Indian culture of Mexico is a fact that in itself calls into question the plans for integration into a national culture postulated as quote-unquote superior. There does not exist a unified national culture, but rather a heterogeneous grouping of different and even contradictory ways of life. One of which the principal causes of this heterogeneity is the different way in which each group has been historically related to Mesoamerican civilization. A basic casual factor in cultural diversity is the land base. Geographical variation, without being an absolute determinant of cultural differences, without doubt underlies many distinguishing characteristics of regional lifeways. This is a universal phenomenon that had great importance, as we saw, in the birth and development of Mesoamerican civilization. The diversity and contrast of ecological niches, each with different natural resources, has been the permanent framework for the cultural configuration of Mexico. Its particular importance has not always been the same because the natural world acquires significance and is transformed into a resource for human beings only through culture, and the culture has varied in the course of history. The regions of Mexico have been studied from different points of view. The country has been divided up in terms of physical geography, soil types, relief, vegetation, climate, and similar variables. Economic regions have also been delineated according to the distribution and characteristics of production activities. Most of these studies refer to the contemporary period. Only a few isolated studies give a panorama of the historical development of certain economic regions. Until now, there has not been a work that includes all the cultural regions of Mexico. It is clear that this task presents additional problems. It is not reliable to delineate a region by the simple presence or absence of a certain number of isolated cultural traits. It is also difficult to deal with all the historical and contemporary information that would allow construction of an image closer to reality by taking into account that cultural regions are historical phenomena that are transformed and reaccommodated by many factors. Although we do not have a systematic panorama, the existence of different regional cultures is an undeniable fact that is easily verified simply by traveling through the country with the senses alert and a willingness to talk with the people. A northerner differs from a jarocho from Veracruz and from someone from the Bajío in his habits, his manners, and customs, and in all the diverse aspects of his culture. One cannot generalize about northerners, however, because the rural culture of Sonora is not like that of Nuevo León, not to mention the differences between the countryside and the city, which we will discuss shortly. Different histories have created particular social spaces and ways of occupying the land. Contingents of colonists of varied origins arrived, and their initial objectives were not the same, varying as they did from mining to ranching to commerce to establishing secure frontiers. They also built different kinds of relationships with the Indian population that occupied each region before the European invasion. In some areas, Indian enclaves have survived, while in others, the original population was annihilated, expelled, or de-Indianized. A few small areas are characterized by relatively recent foreign settlements. For example, the U.S. blacks who settled in El Nacimiento in the municipality of Musquis, Coahuila, the French San Rafael, Veracruz, or the Italians of Chipilo, Puebla. The influence of African culture brought by slaves, which has been little studied, most certainly left a different imprint in each zone according to the size of the black population, its relative magnitude in the local demography, and the particular conditions of the relationship with the rest of local society. Throughout the country and in the interior of each region, there is a marked contrast between the countryside and the cities. The urban ways of life are visibly different from the rural. Here again, the use of census data is misleading and of little futility. The figure of 2,500 inhabitants as a criterion for distinguishing rural from urban localities does not reflect reality. Many much larger communities have a rural culture, and a vast sectors of the large cities also maintain, to a large extent, lifeways that reflect recent rural origins and interrelationship with the rural world. Apart from the precise quantification of the rural and urban parts of the Mexican population, it is clear that both are present and embody different cultures, helping accentuate the cultural diversity of the non-Indian sector. The major implications of the city/countryside duality will be discussed in the third section of this chapter. Apart from the horizontal cultural differences between regions of the country and urban-rural sectors, the cultural panorama of non-Indian society is complicated even more by the presence of vertical distinctions, that is, the hierarchical division of society into classes and strata. Unlike the cultural contrasts that result from the coexistence of ethnic groups or the consolidation of culturally distinct regions, the cultural variation that results from the division into classes and strata should be understood in terms of levels. In a society with common origins, the component groups participate in a common culture to different degrees, depending on the ruling social order that gives opportunities and privileges to certain sectors to the detriment of others. In non-Indian Mexican society, the problem of cultural levels is necessarily tied to the two fundamental origins of the population, Indian and European. Ideologically, it may be maintained that we have a mestizo society that harmoniously combines the racial background and culture of the two primary sources. However, the reality is different because the majority of the popular classes and sectors have Indian origins, often very recent. In consequence, they have been able to maintain many more elements of Mesoamerican culture. On the other hand, some upper-class sectors are derived more or less directly from the Spanish colonizers and tend to conserve non-Indian cultural forms. This problem will be discussed in greater detail in Chapter 7. Thus, the cultural panorama of non-Indian society is far from being homogeneous. The presence of that which is Indian, an underlying cause of heterogeneity, is also different in different regions, in the countryside and in the cities, and in the different social classes and strata. Let us explore the situation in general terms. The peasant world. There are a large number of traditional rural communities that are not considered Indian and whose inhabitants do not claim to be so. Nevertheless, a close examination of traditional rural culture reveals a marked similarity with many aspects of Indian culture outlined in the previous chapter. This is true to such a degree that it may be stated that these communities have an Indian culture, but have lost a sense of identity that goes with it. The basic economic activity is agriculture, to which a large extent makes use of Indian techniques. Corn continues to be the principal crop, along with other products of the milpa, depending on local conditions. There may be greater use of the plow and of draft animals, a practice favored by the haciendas, which occupied the flatlands easily cultivated with the plow. The haciendas generally promoted the de-Indianization process. In terms of land tenure, individual property coexists with ejidos and communal mountain land. In the organization of agricultural work, people make use of family solidarity and the cooperation of neighbors based on reciprocity. Wage labor in agricultural tasks is infrequent. Myths, stories, and legends in which the natural world figures as a living entity persist, as do proprietary practices and beliefs about supernatural beings, all of which are clearly of indigenous origin. On the other hand, The vision of the cosmos that might give coherence and meaning to these ideas and practices appears fragmented, and collectively it is more weakly expressed than in Indian communities. The mestizo handcrafts of traditional communities are not very different from those found in Indian communities. It is true that some have been lost. For example, the manufacture of huipils, or huipiles, traditional women's blouses, and other items of clothing, and some objects associated with ceremonial life. But artistic abilities are found in equal measure and are applied in the same way, that is, as a sheaf of cultural resources developed generally by community members. They all contribute to relative self-sufficiency in different levels of social organization. Here, as well, the economic orientation looks towards self-sufficiency, although in general terms, the degree of commercial exchange may be greater than in Indian communities. In the realm of communal organization, the municipal council, or ayuntamiento, is stronger and has more authority than in Indian communities. Nevertheless, the barrios persist and have some of the functions of the indigenous parajes and barrios. The cargo system remains, although it primarily involves religious activities. The fulfillment of such cargos continues to be a legitimate way of acquiring prestige and social recognition. Sumptuary expenses continue to be of great importance as a goal of economic activities. The presence of Indian culture is clearly visible in other aspects of life in traditional peasant communities. Living quarters and food habits, for example, are adapted to similar patterns if one compares Indian and non-Indian communities that occupy similar ecological niches. To restore health, people resort to various practices that form part of the indigenous heritage. It is common to find herbalists, bone setters, and midwives whose practices are difficult to distinguish from those of their Indian counterparts. What then makes traditional peasant communities different from Indian ones? A first obvious characteristic is the language. The non-Indian peasant speaks only Spanish. This statement must be qualified by two frequently found features. First, many times elderly people and some families remember the original Indian language, although its use is restricted and communication is generally in Spanish. Second, the number of words of Indian origin is greater than in the standard Spanish dialect in the region. Nevertheless, it is a fact that Spanish and not an Indian language is spoken in these traditional communities. However, this fact does not explain the Indianness or non-Indianness of communities that share very similar cultures. Neither is Indianness determined by distinctive clothing, which is a result and not a cause of belonging to an Indian community. The absence of an Indian ethnic identity has much more profound significance because it reveals that a mechanism of identification has been broken, one that allowed the designation of an us related to a cultural patrimony that was ours alone. Indian culture persists to a large degree, but the group that holds it and uses it no longer identifies itself as an articulated whole in relation to which only members of the group have decision-making rights. Since that rupture, traits such as language itself and a distinctive form of clothing lose one of the important functions that make them necessary. They no longer serve as elements to identify us, a group that corresponds to an ethnically differentiated group. For some writers, this change is a result of acculturation, of close contact with another society that possesses a different culture. For others, it relates to an inescapable historical process in which caste-type relations are transformed into class relations. Along the same lines, others try to see the change as a sign of proletarianization, which is also inevitable. I prefer to speak of ethnocide and de-Indianization, concepts that I will elaborate later. De-Indianization of rural communities is a process that has occurred at a different pace throughout the history of Mexico, as will be seen in Part 2. It is easy to find communities recognized today as mestizo, but that were Indian at the beginning of this century or even more recently. In these situations, it is not surprising that a predominantly Indian culture has been preserved in many areas of life. Thus, the change from Indian community to traditional peasant community is not to be understood as a transformation that implies the abandonment of a Mesoamerican way of life. Rather, it is a process that occurs in the realm of ideology. Change occurs when the pressures of the dominant society succeed in breaking the ethnic identity of the Indian community. This does not mean that de-Indianization is purely a subjective change. In fact, The pressures from the dominant society intensify precisely when the presence of groups with a distinct identity constitutes an obstacle to practical objectives. These objectives may include obtaining labor to work outside the community, or implementing a modernization program promoted by the dominant society. De-Indianization has been achieved when, ideologically, the population stops considering itself Indian, even though the lifeway may continue much as before. Such communities are now Indian without knowing that they are Indian. The rural peasant world is not limited to traditional communities. In various regions of the country, a completely capitalist agriculture dominates. The harvest from these agro-industries is destined for the market, often a foreign one. The orientation of this agriculture is not for self-sufficiency, but for accumulating profit. Its operation requires wage labor, and it depends on monoculture. Many Indians and traditional peasants travel to these zones in search of seasonal work, and then the contingents of workers also go to the United States. The campesino, in extreme cases, has given way to the farmer and the agricultural impresario and the wage worker. Even in this rural world so different from the one I have called traditional, many elements of Indian culture flourish. Local life includes traits that are unmistakably Indian in terms of food, medicine, and other social practices. Temporary workers do not lose contact with their cultures of origin, and they renew these contacts by periodically returning to their communities. For them, capitalist agriculture is a different world, an outside world, where one goes when impelled by circumstances. Without taking into account the background of Indian culture that wage workers carry with them, it is impossible to understand the practical way they are integrated into capitalist agriculture. This is true even though they may come from non-Indian communities. The rural world, taken as a whole and in spite of its regional differences and different forms of agricultural production, has a strangely Indian cultural flavor. It is manifested in many aspects of life, although it varies with local circumstances. Two facts are of particular relevance. First, the rich agricultural tradition of Mesoamerican civilization represents an accumulated experience and a long process of adaptation to local conditions. It is not easy to bypass successfully. That tradition, as we have seen, is a complex that includes cultivation techniques and associated knowledge within the framework of a particular conception of nature. The practice of this agricultural tradition requires a certain social environment and an intellectual and emotional perspective. It can be transformed, and in fact transforms itself constantly, but it must nevertheless maintain a certain coherence in order for the whole complex to function properly. This fact explains the presence of many Indian traits in the rural world. A second fact shall not be overlooked. With the imposition of the colonial regime, physical space as well as society was divided into two opposite and incompatible poles. The city was the seat of colonial power and the limited geographical realm of the conquistador. The countryside, on the other hand, was the physical space of the colonized, of the Indians. This separation allowed the persistence of forms of social organization belonging to the rural Indian world, which in turn allowed the dynamic continuity of Mesoamerican cultural configurations. Between the city and the countryside, relations were never those of equal to equal, but rather of the subjugation of the rural/Indian to the urban/Spanish. This identification persists today. In urban sectors as well as among the Indian population and in the rural peasant communities, within this framework to which I will return, we can better understand the defining presence of Indian culture in rural Mexico. The Indian heritage in the cities. The city was the bastion of colonial order. There, the invaders established their privileged space of domination. Many cities were built over the ruins of ancient centers of Indian population, but others were constructed on sites that had not had permanent settlements before. Everything depended on the needs and interests of the colonization process. In some cases, the predominant urgency was to establish a center of power in areas occupied by a dense sedentary population, thus assuring an ample labor force, services, and products that were indispensable for the consolidation and expansion of the colonial enterprise. In other cases, it was necessary to found towns and cities to exploit the mines and obtain gold and silver, the desired precious metals. When the mining areas were far inland, in the territory of the nomadic and warlike groups of the north, it was critical to found cities other than the mining centers themselves. These other centers would provide greater security on the roads for the transportation of precious minerals, food supplies, and the necessary labor force. It is a fact that the chronology of the founding of European settlements in New Spain exactly parallels the slow development of the various enterprises important to colonization: warfare, pacification, mining, European agriculture, stock raising, and both internal and external commerce. All this required the congregation of European population centers of variable size based on possibilities and needs. They were scattered centers of power in a territory that was outside the perimeters of the cities, still indigenous. But even in the cities, there was an Indian presence. Mexico City had barrios and neighborhoods inhabited exclusively by Indians. There was spatial segregation, which expressed the nature of the colonial order. The center consisted of the city as such, that is, the Spanish city, while the Indian barrios formed the periphery. Drastic regulations existed to assure the residential separation of colonizers and colonized. The Spaniards, peninsulares, were prohibited from living in Indian localities, and the Indians, for their part, were obliged to live only in the urban areas assigned to them. Material vestiges of that separation remain in Mexico City and other urban centers. They include the quadrangular layout of the central Spanish city and the names of the old Indian barrios and towns that adjoined it, absorbed today by urban expansion. They also include differences in architecture, the names of many streets, and perhaps an old sentry post which marked the boundaries of the original city. For centuries, urban Indians lived in the city, but under different living conditions from the European colonizers. They lived segregated on the margin of many aspects of city life, because the real city was an area of colonial power, which was off limits to Indians, to the colonized. The organization of urban barrios has been brutally and systematically attacked by the excessive growth of the great cities. There has also been an erratic application of administrative measures, which demonstrates the lack of any urban policy even moderately attentive to the needs of the population. Rarely have the territorial divisions within cities been based on the spatial distribution of the forms of social organization that really exist. Rather, measures have been taken for purely administrative ends. The placement of great urban structures and the transportation systems has generally followed technocratic criteria, which ignored the social and cultural fabric that makes urban life possible. Financial speculation on urban property provokes displacement and reaccommodation of the population, always to the detriment of the poorest sectors. The old Indian barrios became desirable areas when they ceased being the periphery and were incorporated into the center of the city itself. The outlying towns, in turn, were and continue to be engulfed by voracious and uncontrolled urban growth. In spite of these processes, some communities resist and others rebuild themselves. They are not Indian barrios in the strict sense of the term, although historically they may derive from ancient Indian communities. In many cases, they preserve features that prove their origin. In some urban zones, the original indigenous languages continue to be spoken within the family as well as in certain aspects of communal life. In various parts of the city, and not only in the periphery, which remains more rural than urban, organizations called mayordomías continued to organize the fiestas for the local saint. The extended family plays an important role in organizing cooperation within the domestic group. Rituals and celebrations of Indian origin, which include the ceremonies for the Day of the Dead and pilgrimages to the famous sanctuaries, continue in the very heart of the city. There are groups that, through dances and rites of ancient origin, exalt a generic Indian origin without reference to any specific group or region or community. An example is the so-called concheros, which recruit a large part of their membership from city inhabitants. The urban markets, at least in the central and southern part of the country, always offer a great diversity of products that originated in Mesoamerican civilization. They include a rich variety of foods for popular consumption, foods that may be scorned by other urban sectors. There are crayfish and prickly pear leaves, or nopales, fermented agave beer, pulque, and bean or chickpea filled pastries, or tlacoyos, huazontles, Chinpondium natalias, and grasshoppers, prickly pear fruit, and fleshy leaves of the agave plant. On the outskirts, distributed in an orderly way similar to that described by the chroniclers of the 16th century, can be found the herbalist stands. They have remedies for every kind of problem and amulets to avoid danger. When one has the opportunity to visit markets in other parts of the world, one recognizes with surprise the profoundly Indian character of the urban markets of Mexico. And all these traits are really only a small sample of the city's underlying cultural heritage, the living inheritance of their ancient Indian population, which today has been de-Indianized. Approaching the old barrios of the city allows us to see in hazy outline a way of life that is the result of the adaptation of many Mesoamerican cultural forms over a long time period and in conditions of subordination to the dominant culture to an urban context. It is interesting, for example, to compare the old urban housing arrangements, vecinidades, with the new multifamily structures that have been built to replace them. In the vecinidad, the private rooms are lined along a common patio where communal areas for important functions are also found. Bathrooms, water taps, wash basins, play areas, and work areas. All of these tend to strengthen the relations between the inhabitants and generate a group spirit. This spirit is weaker in the new multifamily structures, where the effort is to provide each apartment with all the basic requirements for daily life, and where the common areas are simply parking lots, sidewalks, commercial zones, or at the most, sports areas. In these multifamily structures, only the very young, by playing together and through easily developed group competition with youths from other buildings or units or barrios, are able to develop some sort of group spirit in relation to the place where they live. Here we have face-to-face ways of understanding and experiencing communal life. In the case of the modern multifamily structures, the privileged area is the apartment, the exclusive space of the nuclear family. In the other, the vecinidad, the communal patio is the axis of daily life for a collection of families, many of them extended families. Behind these facts are different cultural orientations. One corresponds to individualism, which is dominant in contemporary Western civilization. The other points toward a local society in which communal ties play a greater role, as they do in Mesoamerican civilization. This situation permits the growth of cultural forms belonging to one's own group in a daily environment broader than that offered by the nuclear family. It is not surprising that the barrios with a large number of vecinidades are those that manifest a more vigorous local identity and a more solid communal organization to carry out different tasks. This became evident in the events following the massive earthquake of September 1985. Although many things have happened since the founding of the first colonial cities, even today there are phenomena that make evident their dominant nature. In the refuge regions, the central point is the Ladino city that dominates a surrounding constellation of Indian communities. Economic, political, social, and religious control resides in and is exercised from this city. It is the center of power. Those who unrightfully hold this power are not the Indians, but the Ladinos, who like to call themselves cultured people or gente de razón, and who proclaim with pride their non-Indian descent from European colonizers. In these cities, the presence of that which is Indian marks every aspect of life. The majority of those traveling through the streets are Indians, as are those who go to the market to sell and to the stores to buy, those who work at the most poorly paid occupations, those who fill the jails, and those who at nightfall stumble drunkenly back to their communities. But that which is Indian is also present in the conduct and thought of the urban Ladino, in part because the Ladino has adopted some traits from the regional Indian culture as regards food, language, and certain beliefs and symbolic practices. But fundamentally, it is because the life of the Ladino is structured in terms of contrast with that of the Indian by the necessity of permanently marking everything with an indelible "not Indian." In the small Ladino world of these cities, that which is Indian is omnipresent as everything one is not and does not want to be. Guzman Bachler, 1970, pages 101 through 121, has written that in Guatemala the Ladino is a fictitious being because the essence of his identity is negative. Being Ladino is not being anything specific of one's own, but just being not Indian. Without the presence of the Indian, the Ladino ceases to be, since he exists only through the colonial domination exercised over the Indian. The accelerated growth of the large Mexican cities in the last 50 years is due principally to the arrival of Indian or mestizo immigrants from the rural zones. The dynamics of the process involve the impoverishment of the countryside and the concentration of economic activities and opportunities of all sorts in the urban zones. The migration Indianizes the city. In general, the new arrival can count on family or friends from the same village who have arrived before him. They facilitate his first contact with the city, helping him adapt and find work. Together, they form a nucleus of people identified by their local culture of origin. In this small world transferred from the village, they can speak their own language and recreate, as far as possible, their own practices and customs. Sometimes the group becomes larger since it is easy to identify with people of the same region above and beyond the specific traits of each community. Then it is possible to establish a broader cultural environment that goes beyond that of daily domestic life. Tournaments of pelota mixteca, a ballgame of pre-Hispanic origin, can be organized, or a mixe band to play the music of the home region. The fiestas of the homeland can be celebrated with appropriate dishes whose special ingredients are either brought by the most recent traveler or substituted with something acceptable from the urban stores. At another level, there are many organizations of countrymen or paisanos now living in the city who try to do something for their native land. Send books to create a library, take important local matters before central authorities, receive and help orient new arrivals to the city. Contact and close relations with the home community are not lost. To the contrary, they are renewed on every possible occasion, since the coming and going of individuals makes it possible to share the latest news: who died, who got married, who left, what has happened to the communal lands invaded by the cattle rancher, or the boundary conflict with the neighboring community. In addition, whenever possible, one returns to the community, even if it is only once a year for the fiesta of the patron saint, and obligations are fulfilled, both those based on the compadrazgo or godparenthood, and those that come from having accepted a ceremonial cargo. In this way, extensive areas of the city are inhabited by people who live there in a transitory way. Their interests and hopes are fixed on what happens many miles distant, in the village or neighborhood of which they form a part, and which gives meaning to an immigration they hope will be temporary. They are Indians who exercise their own culture insofar as the city allows. It is not uncommon for them to hide their identity and deny their place of origin and their language in their contacts with, quote, the others, end quote. The city, after all, continues to be the center of foreign power and of discrimination. But their identity persists, disguised and clandestine, and because of that identity, their membership in their original group is maintained. With it go loyalties and reciprocity, rights and obligations, the practice of and ties with a common and exclusive culture. Without that universe of ongoing relationships based on the existence of the Indian communities, the survival of hundreds of thousands of Indian inhabitants of Mexican cities would be impossible. A very revealing fact indicates just how true this is. Mexico City is the place with the largest number of speakers of indigenous languages in all the Americas. The city is also filled with Indian workers, contingents of whom come daily from nearby Indian communities. Others come from distant places and remain in the city during the time they are working. In every part of the city are found the Marias with their children, installed on the corners with the greatest volume of traffic, selling chewing gum and trinkets or begging from passing cars. Many men in badly fitting work clothes labor as masons or at whatever other tasks they can find. Domestic work is more stable and employs a great number of Indian women. Between them often exists a chain of relationships that allows individuals to go from their home community to the regional city and from there to the nation's capital. These networks now extend to several cities in the United States. The situation is different for the Indian students. They are proportionately few, but their numbers increase constantly. By necessity, they must come to the city if they can in order to continue their secondary and higher education. This group also includes some professionals and workers of Indian origin and has been the social circle from which have recently emerged new forms of political organization based on Indian ethnic identity. Urban experiences in contact with different sorts of ideas, information from the broader outside world, and relationships within other Indian immigrants have all made possible the formation of political groups motivated to press the demands of the Indian communities. In another section, I will deal with this theme in greater detail. Here, I simply point out this new Indian political presence is an urban phenomenon which arises precisely in the physical space reserved historically as the seat of non-Indian colonial power. The presence of the Indian in these cities has not passed unperceived by the dominant privileged elites. In earlier times, the Indians were referred to as the masses, or la plebe, But today, another term has become established. They are the Nacos. The word's connotations are undeniably negative, discriminatory, and racist. In particular, the Naco is the Indianized urban inhabitant to whom are attributed tastes and attitudes that are a grotesque imitation of the cosmopolitan behavior to which the elites aspire. The behavior of the Naco is deformed to the point of caricature by a supposed inability and lack of culture. The word Naco, nevertheless, also denigrates anything that is Indian, any trait that recalls the original ancestry of Mexican culture and society. Any fact that evidences the Indian world present in the cities is exorcised by applying it to the simple qualifier Naco. Thus, the city protects itself from its deeper reality. The bronze race and the beautiful people. The apparent presence of the Indian in official Mexican culture is very evident to foreign visitors, especially Latin Americans. The Revolution of 1910 has accorded to the image of the Indian a special privilege, that of serving as one of the major official symbols of nationalism. Later, we will examine the other side of the coin, government policy towards living Indians, or indigenismo. Here, it is important to point out the ideological exaltation of the Indian, which has made his presence visible in the public sphere under state control. Art supported by revolutionary governments, especially between 1920 and 1940, had a very nationalistic character. It was, after all, necessary to go back to our roots. The popular nature of the revolution, much in evidence in those years, led this search for roots along the paths of history until it reached the pre-colonial past. Upon its return to the present, the search for roots legitimized the culture of the nation. If not all of national culture, it at least legitimized those aspects that were easily appreciated. The bucolic life of the campesino, popular handicrafts, and folklore. In music, dance, literature, and the plastic arts, the theme of the Indian provided the basic elements for shaping a vast nationalistic current under government patronage. Hundreds of square meters of murals adorn every type of public building in many cities of the Republic. Murals are in seats of government and public offices, in markets and hospitals, in schools and libraries, in factories and workplaces. In these murals, the image of the Indian is practically indispensable. Rarely is there missing some allegory about the pre-colonial world that frequently lays the foundation for or presides over seeds of the world of today or tomorrow. There is space to indicate the painful transition from a past that was happy and full of wisdom to the horrors of conquest and slavery. There is also space for some pictorial references to the dances and showy ceremonies of contemporary Indians. Brown faces with high cheekbones and almond-shaped eyes, along with the sacred political heroes, occupy the most prominent place in Mexican mural painting. The pre-Columbian codices seem to come to life again in the work of Diego Rivera, to recount history in a different way in terms of the Mexican Revolution. In this sense, the painters of the nationalist school play the role of Anu Tlacaelel, that ancient priest who for many years occupied the position of Chihuahuat, the gray eminence of the Aztec state. Tlacaelel ordered the ancient books destroyed in order to paint new ones that would more adequately portray the history of the glorious Mexica, the people of the sun. Another favored way of exalting the Indian roots of Mexico has been through museums, which exist in most state capitals and in many other cities. The best and most pristine example is the National Museum of Anthropology in Chapultepec Park, a privileged section of Mexico City. The architectural conception in all its details reflects an ideology of exaltation of the pre-colonial past. Simultaneously, and in a contradictory fashion, it expresses a rupture with the present. The proportions and the sobriety of the facade, the amplitude of the vestibule, and the interior plaza, and the elegant magnificence of the finishes bring to mind in some ways the characteristics of Mesoamerican cities. However, they are treated in such a way that the effect also reflects the layout of Christian temples, an entrance with a choir and latticework, the vestibule of the museum, a great central nave, the patio, with lateral chapels, the exhibition rooms, culminating in the front altar, the Mexica room, with the sunstone at its center. All the rooms on the ground floor of the museum are dedicated to archaeology, but each has a corresponding upper area. The major exhibition room dedicated to the Aztecs is the only room that does not have a mezzanine, and it is also larger than the other rooms. The top floor is composed of all the mezzanine rooms and contains the ethnographic exhibits, the reference to the Indians of today. Many visitors do not go through these rooms because of fatigue or lack of interest, both factors directly related to the layout of museum space. The words the visitor sees upon leaving, carved in the huge interior panel of the facade over the entrance doors, precisely summarize the ideological message of the museum and the broader use the state has made of the pre-colonial past. In the greatness of their past, people find courage and confidence to face the future. Mexican, contemplate yourself in the mirror of that greatness. Foreigner, see proof here of the unity of human destiny. Civilizations pass, but humanity will always preserve the glory of others who struggle to build those civilizations. The Indian presence, as depicted in murals, museums, sculptures, and archaeological sites, all open to the public, is treated essentially as a dead world. It is a unique world, extraordinary in many of its achievements, but still a dead world. Official discourse, translated into the language of the plastic arts or of the museography, exalts that dead world as the seed of origin that gave rise to today's Mexico. It is the glorious past of which we should feel proud, which assures us a lofty historical destiny as a nation, even though the logic of that assertion may not be entirely clear. The living Indian and all that is Indian are relegated to a second floor when they are not ignored or denied. As in the National Museum of Anthropology, the contemporary Indian occupies a segregated space, disconnected from the glorious past as well as from the present, which does not belong to him, an expendable space. The Renaud Duarte Ideological Academy, that past has become our past, that of the Mexicans who are not Indians. However, it is an inert past, a simple reference to what existed as a kind of premonition of what Mexico is today and will be in the future. It has no real connection with our contemporary reality and our collective future. Today, other aspects receive official attention designed to stimulate the growth of tourism. These include the restoration of archaeological zones and the commercialization of indigenous handicrafts. That which is Indian is sold as a unique image, which provides a touch of local color, an accent of the exotic to attract tourists. This is an Indian Mexico for external consumption. What is Indianness for the elites of the country? In what way is it present among the beautiful people? In general, no one in these strata claims any indigenous ancestors. To the contrary, the usual situation is an ostentatious claim of European lineage, of descent that has been maintained without mixture over the generations. When possible, the emblems of a more or less doubtful nobility are exhibited. There are families that still conserve a coat of arms that presides over the principal living room of the house. If the family does not proclaim noble blood, it asserts a modest origin, a fortune, and a social position earned through effort and talent. Although it may not be stated baldly, these characteristics are always associated with ancestors who were not Indians, just as their descendants are not Indians today. The Indians were the workers on grandfather's hacienda, and the Indian women were the domestic servants of that period. When there were lands worked by peons, enjoying social occasions together with them from time to time was inevitable. In some families of ancient oligarchical ancestry, there is a continuing love of horse racing, of ranch-style home cooking, of cockfights, and of a certain religious flavor to domestic life. This is all part of being Mexican, and one can enjoy it occasionally on Sundays. Here, one runs into that which is Indian, but only if one looks down. Looking straight ahead at equals, the skin is white and the hair and eyes are light. No one speaks Nahuatl, but many speak French, and today, almost everyone speaks English. In an anthology issue, the U.S. magazine Town and Country presented The Mighty Mexicans, a parade of photographs and brief descriptions of the most powerful people in the country. This was, naturally, during the elation of the oil boom. In a cursory view of the life and tastes of this privileged sector, the mighty Mexicans were presented in their daily surroundings, their homes and factories, their offices and their places of relaxation. Symptomatically, a group of young married socialites appear in their finest clothing and jewelry. In each photograph, there is a decorative element that indicates beyond a doubt the model's Mexicanness. Beside her, there is an Indian woman in an authentic weeple, a short, plump, smiling woman with brown skin and a grateful look on her face. Any one of these photographs represents an extreme synthesis of the colonial schizophrenia in which we live. The middle classes of urban society have grown rapidly in the last 5 or 6 decades. They live daily within this schizophrenia. The old aristocracy looked to Europe for models of conduct and thought, but the middle classes of today have only to look to the other side of the northern border. The United States provides all the archetypes to configure middle-class aspirations. One's real origins do not matter. That not very distant past that remains buried in a provincial city, in a por barrio, in a small town, or even in an Indian village. What matters are the small achievements of today and their material manifestation in the consumption of electric appliances, smuggled clothing, and occasional trips to San Antonio and Disneyland. It is difficult to reconcile continually growing aspirations with limited possibilities in a situation that finally deteriorates into a crisis with no apparent resolution. The middle classes here are characterized by a profound cultural uprootedness. There is a will to renounce the life lived until very recently, and a feeble, poorly articulated will to reconstruct the current lifestyle. The household space is not organized according to necessities and tastes that are one's own. One buys or rents according to the bargains available. One furnishes according to the advertisements of the moment. One may decorate in ranch style. The important thing is that one's home not look like a poor, working-class abode. To make that point clear, there are imitation felt cushions, the color television in the center of the room, the electric appliances in full view, and the implausible, brightly colored prints on the walls. Traditional culture of whatever background has no explicit place here. It remains buried and comes into view only occasionally and unexpectedly, like a detail that calls into question everything that is apparent. Where all daily things are replaceable, coffee, sugar, pork cracklings, happiness, beauty, then in fact culture and life itself are replaceable. Can that which is Indian be here? Perhaps it is in some corner of patriotic discourse, in the interstices of an evening of typical folklore, enjoyed along with the new acquaintance from El Paso. Disconnected from its roots, the middle class dances to whatever rhythm is played without any desire to remember or any impulse to imagine. If the other is the Mexico Profundo, this is the surface, the superficial Mexico. Cultural schism. A national society composed of more than 80 million people living in a country of widely varied geography. A society embarked on a project of capitalist development which affects different regions, strata, and groups in a very unequal fashion. Such a society is necessarily complex and heterogeneous from the cultural point of view. However, these inequalities and differences have, in the case of Mexico, a deeper background that conditions cultural dynamics. Mexico's background distinguishes it from societies that have an ancient and solidary cultural unity within which occur variation and inequalities that form true subcultures within a general framework. Here, the pattern is different. The underlying opposition that determines the structure and cultural dynamics of Mexican society is the confrontation of two civilizations, Indian Mesoamerica and the Christian West. It is not possible to understand the cultural characteristics of the Mexican population in terms of a spectrum of gradual variation, as if it were an uninterrupted continuum that links the most backward with the most developed, the traditional with the modern, the rural with the urban. What here we call advanced, modern, and urban is not the leading edge of an internal self-development, but rather the result of the implantation of Western civilization from above. What we call backward, traditional, and rural is not the beginning point of that development, but instead the underlying stratum of Mesoamerican civilization. The relationship between the two poles was never and is not today harmonious. On the contrary, it is a relationship that until now has been irreconcilable because it rests on the imposition of Western civilization and the consequent subjugation of Indian civilization. There is not a simple coexistence between the poles, which would probably facilitate reciprocal cultural interchange and might result in their unification, as proclaimed in official ideology. What exists is an asymmetrical relationship of domination and subjugation in which the majority Indian population is not conceded the right to conserve and carry out its own civilizational development. If such development occurs, it is only through the incessant resistance of the Indian groups, a resistance that takes the most varied forms. In terms of the dominant ideology, Indian civilization does not exist. The civilizational confrontation is masked by the phraseology of the development, in its various modalities, which converts the imposition of a foreign civilization into a natural and inevitable process of historical advancement. The cultural diversity of Mexican society goes back ultimately to the antagonistic opposition of two civilizations. At its extreme points, the contrast and opposition are evident and total. The old aristocratic oligarchy and its modern descendants, who promote technocratic modernity, confront the Indian communities that still preserve their own identity. In the broad intermediary sectors and groups, the situation seems more or less clear at first glance. Traditional campesinos do not think of themselves as Indians, even though their culture is predominantly Indian. The subordinate urban groups are not culturally homogeneous. Some keep as a culture of reference that of their home communities, Indian or mestizo. Others have forged a popular urban culture of Indian inclination, but adapted and transformed through long experience of life in the city. Others find themselves in anomia, in instability, fluctuating between urban misery and middle-class self-absorption. For their part, the middle strata have not created a lifestyle of their own. They do not possess a culture that they themselves developed. In general, they consume foreign cultural products offered to them by an easily controlled market. These products vary from opinions and aspirations to foods and recreation, from idiomatic phrases to a taste for bestsellers. Cultural diversity is not a problem in itself. In fact, it constitutes tangible and intangible cultural capital of enormous potential for the country. There exists a plurality of accumulated historical experiences which form a vast repertoire of resources to confront the most varied situations. The problem lies in the dual, asymmetrical structure that underlies that plurality. At this point, it is indispensable to return to the origin of this problem, which is none other than the colonial situation from which current Mexican society is derived. This is a past whose basic antagonistic duality has not yet been superseded. To the contrary, it is expressed in every facet of national life. It is an original sin that has not yet been redeemed. This concludes both Chapter 3 and Part 1.